The African savanna stretched endlessly, a vast golden expanse shimmering under the relentless heat of the midday sun. The wind, dry and restless, whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the distant echoes of life and death. Here, in this untamed wilderness, the law of nature reigned supreme. Only the strongest, the most ruthless, could carve their legacy into the unforgiving earth. And none had ruled more fiercely than Kasai, a name that echoed like thunder across the valley, a king whose very presence commanded awe and submission. His mane, thick and golden, billowed like a storm cloud in the wind. His eyes burned with a fire that had never known fear. Every scar that adorned his powerful frame was a testament to the battles he had fought, the rivals he had vanquished, and the blood he had spilled to keep his kingdom unchallenged. But today, something was different. Something unseen, something insidious, had crept into his body like a shadow slipping beneath a door. There were no challengers prowling his land, no lurking enemies waiting in the grass. Yet an invisible predator had found him, one that would not fight him tooth and claw but from within, one that would strip him of his power, his strength, his very will to survive. It began as a whisper, an imperceptible shift in his being. His steps felt heavier, his breath labored. The heat of the sun seemed to bite deeper than before, and the air itself felt denser, suffocating. At first, he dismissed it, a moment of exhaustion, perhaps, a small price to pay for ruling a kingdom that demanded constant vigilance. He had survived worse. He was a lion, the king of the savannah. Fatigue was nothing more than a fleeting nuisance. But then came the itching, a deep, maddening sensation crawling beneath his skin like fire ants burrowing through his flesh. It was unbearable. No amount of scratching could quell it. His powerful claws raked through his fur, desperate to tear away whatever invisible force tormented him. The burning only spread, growing hotter, hungrier, as if something inside him was awakening. A growl rumbled from his throat, a mixture of frustration and confusion. He shook himself violently, sending dust into the air, his massive frame quivering as though under siege. But nothing changed. The pain did not retreat. Instead, it crept deeper, latching onto him with an unseen grip. His pride watched from a distance, their golden eyes filled with something he had never seen before, fear. They had stood by him through storms, through wars, through the unrelenting brutality of the wild. Yet now, they hesitated. Something about their king was wrong. The aura of dominance that once surrounded him like an impenetrable fortress had begun to crack. Kasai staggered forward, his limbs heavy as stone. The watering hole glistened ahead, its surface a mirror of tranquility. Perhaps the coolness of the water would offer relief, would wash away whatever unseen force had taken hold of him. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the edge, muscles trembling as he bent down to drink. Then he saw it. A reflection that did not belong to him. His golden coat, once pristine, was alive, moving, writhing. Tiny black specks pulsed beneath his flesh like an army of invaders crawling just beneath the surface. His blood turned cold, horror sinking into his bones. His powerful body, the vessel of his strength, his dominance, was no longer his own. The itching intensified. His skin felt like it was tearing, stretching from within. His throat vibrated with an unearthly snarl, his breath ragged. This was no ordinary sickness. This was something far worse. The parasites were not just feeding on him. They were multiplying. His vision blurred as the realization clawed its way into his mind. The land around him tilted, his legs buckling. He tried to shake them off, to rid himself of the writhing horror beneath his skin, but it was useless. He was their host now. And then, from the tall grass, they came. Not hyenas, not jackals, not the scavengers that usually lurked in the shadows, waiting for kings to fall. These creatures were smaller, many-legged, unrelenting. A writhing black tide moving in perfect synchronization, clicking and chittering in eerie unison. Kasai's pride took another step back. Even his mate, the lioness who had fought beside him, bled with him, feared him, now feared for him. Instinct screamed at them to run, to flee from their once mighty king who now stood on the precipice of something unnatural. Kasai tried to roar, to assert his power, to remind the world of who he was, but the sound that came from his throat was no longer a roar. It was a choked, strangled whimper. And then his body moved, not with the grace of a lion, but with the jerky, unnatural convulsions of a marionette whose strings had been seized by something else. His golden eyes, once filled with fire and dominance, now burned with something foreign, something that was not him. The parasites had won. And as darkness crept into the edges of his vision, the last thing he heard was the whispering hum of 1,000 tiny legs, marching toward their next host. Beneath his golden coat, beneath his very flesh, There was movement. At first, it was subtle, a slow, rhythmic undulation just beneath the surface of his skin. Something foreign, something wrong. Tiny black specks, no larger than grains of sand, slithered within his veins, twisting and writhing like roots burrowing into fertile ground. They pulsed. They grew. They multiplied. Kasai's breath hitched, his massive chest rising and falling with labored effort. The world around him blurred as an unnatural heat overtook his body. His limbs felt leaden, unresponsive, as though some invisible force had bound him in chains. Then came the pain, a deep, agonizing sensation that radiated from within, a burning inferno that no amount of thrashing could extinguish. And then he screamed. The sound that tore from his throat was not a roar of power, nor one of defiance. It was raw, primal terror, a cry so unearthly that the very earth seemed to tremble in response. Trees shook, birds erupted from the canopies in a flurry of panicked wings, and his pride, the ones who had followed him through every battle, every storm, took a step back. They had never heard their king cry out like this. He thrashed wildly, his body no longer his own. Every muscle twitched with spasms beyond his control. He clawed at his flesh, raking deep grooves into his once pristine golden coat, desperate to dig out the invaders. But it was too late. The parasites had infested him. Not just a handful, not even hundreds, but thousands, perhaps millions. They had made him their home. They were inside him now, and they were still spreading. The real horror was yet to begin. A deep, grotesque tear split through the skin on his shoulder. Blood oozed out, thick and dark, but it was not blood alone. From the gaping wound, something crawled. At first, it was just a few tiny, black-legged creatures wriggled their way free from his flesh, their minuscule bodies glistening under the sun. But then came more. Dozens, hundreds, thousands, spilling forth like a living tide, cascading from the wound in an endless, unrelenting stream. Their tiny legs clicked against each other, their chittering whispers blending into a singular, deafening hum. Kasai's legs buckled beneath him. His mighty frame, once the embodiment of power, now sagged under the weight of his own infestation. His fur, once thick and regal, crawled with unnatural movement. His body was no longer just his, it was theirs. His pride recoiled in horror. Some let out low growls, their ears flattened against their skulls, their instincts warning them of something unnatural. Others simply stood frozen, their golden eyes wide with something they had never felt before: fear. Even his mate, the lioness who had fought beside him for years, who had borne his cubs, who had defended his reign, took a step back. Kasai tried to move, to shake them off, to be free, but his body refused to obey. His muscles spasmed with unnatural jerks, his limbs twitching like a broken marionette dangling on invisible strings. His breath came in ragged gasps, his once mighty heart hammering in his chest like a caged beast. And his eyes, those golden firelit orbs that had once struck fear into enemies and admiration into allies, were no longer his own. Something had replaced him. The parasites had taken over. And then, from the tall grass they came. Not hyenas, not jackals, not the usual scavengers that lurked in the shadows, waiting for kings to fall. No, these creatures were different. They were smaller, stronger, unrelenting. A writhing black tide slithered forward, a moving mass of tiny bodies, clicking legs, and hunger. They did not come to feast on flesh. They did not seek the scraps left behind by greater predators. They came for control. The clicking grew louder, a sickening rhythmic march that echoed through the valley. They did not hurry, for they did not need to. Their victory had already been decided. Kasai was no longer their king, he was their vessel. His pride took another step back. This was no longer their leader. This was something else, something unnatural, something that should not be. Kasai tried to roar, to warn them, to beg for help. But no sound came, only a weak, choked whimper. And then he moved, not with the controlled, fluid grace of a lion, not with the raw power that had once made him untouchable, but with an unnatural, jerking twitch, as if something else had seized control of his body. His muscles rippled, but not by his own will. His paws dragged against the dry earth, but not by his own command. His head lifted, and his eyes, as once filled with fire, now glowing with something foreign, swept across the savannah. The parasites had won. Kasai, the great king of the savannah, the ruler of the wild, the predator of predators, had become nothing more than a puppet, and as the last vestiges of his own will faded into the abyss, the last thing he heard was the relentless, eerie march of 1,000 tiny legs, moving forward, seeking their next host.